Welcome to the 2025 Orthogonal Research and Education Lab in Review. We're going to talk about progress we've made in a number of areas this year, including publications, initiatives, events that we've attended, and other things that are of interest and we'd like to follow up on in the new year. This is an array of different logos for different initiatives. So we have the Cybernetic Interest Group, we have Society, Ethics, and Technology Interest Group, we have Open Source and Open Science Interest Group, we have Representational Brains and Phenotypes Interest Group, we have our PHASIC group, which combines physical intelligence, augmented systems, and complexity. We have our Saturday morning NeuroSim group and our meetings that we have. And then our Computational Developmental Systems group, which includes DevoWorm, but is more broadly interested in developmental simulation, and computational psychiatry. So this is something I came up with to describe kind of how we interact with other organizations and institutions. So, we are a virtual lab. We do a lot of different types of research in a lot of different types of areas. And so our members interact with many different groups and many different institutions to try to enable some of these things. So we have three sort of layers that we use to kind of organize what we do. The first is the interactive. The second is the collaborative or the collaborations, and the third is the consumptive. So the interactive are the institutions with which we most closely associate. And these could be, interacting in terms of projects or educational initiatives, or, basically it's a two-way street. There's some sort of long-term relationship there. So these include NeurotechX, JoPro, which is Jesse's organization, the Open Room Foundation, INCF, and we've done Google Summer of Code through INCF for the last several years, the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, the Active Research Institute, and the Neuromatch Academy. And so we've interacted with these groups for a while. Then we have our collaborations, which consist of different institutions that we kind of, maybe one or maybe more of our members interact with, but on a more casual basis. So these include our involvement with the Embodied Intelligence Conference, the BICA Conference, Plot Twisters, which is an organization that Jesse is involved with, and then the Innovation Tower in San Francisco. That's something that Morgan's involved with. It's a tower where they have all sorts of different innovator groups and people who are trying to build new things. A lot of interesting technology going on there. So those are our collaborations. And then our consumptive side, which is sort of, we consume what they produce, their content, their publications, things like that, maybe their software. And we have a more casual relationship with these institutions. They definitely inspire what we do. And so that includes the International Society for Artificial Life, CompuCell 3D, the Santa Fe Institute, Brain Inspired, their podcast, and they have a reading group that we've been paying attention to. The Augmentation Lab at MIT, this community of organoid scientists, organoid biologists, and how they've, especially the neural organoid community, and then Ecolopto, which is this group associated with MIT and Florida Atlantic University. And so all of these things, they kind of play a role in what we do. So again, sometimes these organizations are consumptive, meaning we just mainly consume their, what they're producing, and we respond to that. We have maybe a little bit more closely collaborate with some of these groups, and then eventually they become interactive, where we have a longer term relationship with them. So now I want to focus on our conferences, workshops, and presentations as we've encountered them this year. So the first thing on the list here is, so the first thing we did this year was in February. This was a lecture that I gave, and this was on pattern formation in the psychophysical domain. And so this is a lecture that's on YouTube. It was produced for the lab community and for the larger community of people who watch our YouTube channel. And this is describing some work that we've been actually doing in the Diva Worm group, morphogenesis, and different types of ways to characterize morphogenesis. So this is an approach we call interference diffusion pattern formation. So what this is if you've ever taken like two concentric circles and you've overlapped them and then moved them against one another, you get these interference patterns that result from that. And the idea being is that you have basically these gradients that are emitted from a source. And then on the fringes of those gradients, you get interactive patterns that are both involve pattern formation, chemical interactions, but also perceptual illusions or perceptual information within those regions. And so you can see here that you have a bunch of centroids, you have concentric circles around the centroids, which are these decay rings. On the edges of each diffusion pattern, you get these interacting regions that are these fringes that have a lot of complex information in them, especially when those sources are moving around. And so you can think of this in terms of a chemical morphogenetic composition. You can think of this as layers of cells and the resulting composition. Or you can think of this as a perceptual thing. And this is the focus on this lecture, which was that you have this morphogenetic process, you have this collective behavior, so you have more than one source, so sources are interacting, you get this collective behavior. And then you get these different phenomena like Mach bands that occur. And these are perceptual things that feed back to the organism, maybe through their perceptual system, that influence collective behavior and perhaps the morphogenetic process. And so we have all of these things sort of together. We just wanted to kind of lay this out as sort of a way that we view this phenomenon. In April, we did this paper on phylogenetic models of embodied agents. This was a presentation at the Embodied Intelligence. Okay. So in April, we did this presentation on phylogenetic models of embodied agents. This was presented at the Embodied Intelligence Workshop. This was on Zoom. And this is where we've taken our developmental Bradenburg vehicles and we've kind of thought about this as more of a sort of an evolution, from an evolution of development perspective, and then thinking about how the evolution part is phylogenetic composition. So this is an example of Bradenburg vehicles from Bradenburg's book, where he defines different vehicles: 1A, 2A, 2B, 2C, and then 3A, 3B, 3C. So there are these different classes of vehicle. And so what we did for this talk was we created a phylogenetic analysis of these vehicles, looking at the traits that they had in common, looking at these sort of shared derived characteristics, and then looking at common ancestry between different vehicles, and then looking at the outgroup, which was this forward Brownian motion. So, taking information from Bradenburg's book, we're able to construct a phylogenetic analysis. And then, of course, that phylogenetic analysis isn't just useful for Bradenburg vehicles, it's also useful for our developmental Bradenburg vehicles, especially when you develop a Bradenburg vehicle from what is essentially a 2 or 3 layered embryo. And so this takes inspiration from biological development, where you have diploblastic and tripoblastic embryos, and those layers, those germ layers, end up forming the different traits that you have in the adult. And so this just shows one of these morphogenetic processes as defined in an internal encoding. And so, not to get too deeply into this paper, but this builds upon a lot of the work we've done on developmental Bradenburg vehicles, but also on this sort of phylogenetic approach, which was demonstrated in using Bratenberg vehicles from Bratenberg, but also these developmental models. And so this resulted in a paper that's coming out soon in the proceedings. Also in April, we had a poster at the Immerse Symposium. This was at the NCSA at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. So they host this Immerse Symposium. I'm an affiliate of Immerse, so I wanted to present on our phasic project and our giving an overview of the phasic roadmap. So phasic is this project that has a bunch of things in it. It basically stands for physical intelligence, augmented systems, and complexity. And this is our roadmap where we have extended reality with all of its components, intelligence augmentation with all of its components, and these dynamical approaches to cognition. So dynamical approaches to cognition interact with extended reality. Dynamical approaches to cognition regulate intelligence augmentation, and extended reality enables intelligence augmentation. And so this poster kind of laid out this roadmap, showed some of the publications that we've put out on in these different areas, and then proposed that, of course, we have this continuum in extended reality, or XR, between augmented reality and virtual reality, where you have real-world physics and augmented reality, simulated physics and virtual reality, and you have these different behavioral responses that occur along this continuum. And then, of course, we have these mixture of systems, which is where we have constructivist learning, physiological adaptation, and meta-learning, or metacognition. And so, we can take behavior, we can take a technological environment, we can look at the interaction, and we can classify it into these different areas. And then, of course, we use this roadmap to sort of characterize the relationship between XR, IA, and dynamical approaches to cognition. So in June, we had so this is a little tricky. So in June, we put out on the archive this paper, A Good Regulator May Provide a World Model for Intelligent Systems. And this has been now accepted as an article in a special issue within the Royal Society A journal. And this is on integrated world modeling. So Adam Saffron is running this special issue in integrative world modeling. He's interested in how to approach world models in artificial intelligence systems. And so we propose that you can use classical cybernetics, in particular the good regulator theorem, to characterize world models and to improve upon the AI systems that we have today. So this is a diagram from the paper. This is the classic shorthand of the ever good regulator theorem, where we have this regulator and a system, and then this observer, and we have these parameters. And the idea is that this closed loop feedback system will help us find a target on a domain Z, which is the domain of the system. So we want to restrict our search to the optimal points of that domain. And so, the idea is that closed loop feedback allows you to do that adaptively. And so that was what we're talking about in the paper. You can incorporate that into a lot of the learning models that we have available to us. This is an example of a diffusion model where we've tested it for different parameters. So if you go into the paper, there are a lot of kind of examples of things that involve this process of closed loop feedback that might be useful to different types of machine learning systems. We focused on physical types of examples, mapping those to diffusion systems and other types of learning systems as well. So this is a product of our cybernetic interest group. And so we've been working on these ideas for a couple of years, and so it's nice to see this culminate into the special issue. Now the special issue isn't out yet, so we're waiting on that. But for now, just enjoy the archive article, and you basically get the same content. In August, we participated in the Biologically Inspired Cognitive Architectures Conference once again. We've been doing this for several years now, and for this year's presentation, this was on Zoom, but hosted in person in Puerto Vallarta, Mexico. So there's a group in Mexico that does a lot of things with biologically inspired cognitive architectures, and so they were the host. Our talk was the augmentation of intelligent agents for human-machine super performance. And this builds upon some of the things we've been doing with the cybernetics group, some of the things that we've been doing with phasic, and kind of drawing from that and looking at how we can augment agents using different sensory streams and how we can produce the sort of model of human-machine super performance. And so this builds upon a number of the talks that have been given for the BICA conference in years past, especially the one in 2023. And so this is where, we could lay out some of those ideas more cleanly. So this paper is also coming out in the proceedings for the BICA workshop. Again, this involved representational brains and phenotypes and cybernetics. Then in October, we, of course, participated in the 5th Active Inference Symposium. And so that was, I think, November 13th or 15th. And this was hosted by the Active Inference Institute. And so they have the live streams on their website, on their YouTube channel, but we also have this talk on our YouTube channel. And so, or the talks that we gave a couple of talks this year. And so those are on our YouTube channel as well. So this involved the work from our cybernetics interest group. Now this is a paper, this is a preprint that came out of what happened at the 4th Active Inference Symposium. So last year was the 4th Active Inference Symposium. We gave a talk on cybernetics and active inference. The idea here is that we ended up with this paper called A Brief History of Cybernetic Imperatives and Behavior. And this was, of course, also something that came out of our cybernetics reading group. So this paper follows up on this notion of these behavioral typologies that are laid out in Rosenbluth et al. From 1943. And so if you remember that paper, or if you know of that paper, this is the paper where they lay out this set of behaviors from just kind of random behavior to purposeful behavior and all of the steps that are involved in this. And what we did in the talk was we, laid out this typology and then played around with the different components of the typology to really kind of give a modern cast to their characterization of behavior. So their whole characterization of behavior is to explain what's happening in cybernetic regulation with respect to behavior. But in 1943, of course, we had behaviorism, and we didn't have cognitive, the cognitive revolution hadn't happened yet, and we didn't have a lot of the artificial systems that we have today. We also didn't have complexity theory. And so all those things were not accounted for in the original paper. And so we reinterpreted that paper with respect to some of the findings, many of the findings that have happened since. And so we ended up with these different typologies that were reconstructed from the Rosenbluth et al. Paper. Then we ended up with this sort of characterization of different types of behaviors, from random behaviors like Brownian motion to higher order prediction and dynamics. So this is a diagram from this brief history paper where we go from Brownian motion to levy flights to ballistic movements to first order prediction and dynamics to then higher order prediction and dynamics, which are these smooth curves, this integrated behavior, this highly predictive behavior. And so this actually is, in some ways, this is a product of those typologies, but it also describes cybernetic regulation. And so for different orders of regulation, for different ways you can set up cybernetic regulation, different ways you can set up feedback loops and inputs and outputs, you can replicate these different types of behaviors. So this is actually a nice figure that was generated in Notebook LM when I asked it to, and I gave it this diagram to sort of make it less hand-drawn, and it produced this figure where you have Brownian motion over time, levy flights over time, ballistic movements over time, first order prediction, which is this sort of curved behavior but a little bit more predictive, and then higher order prediction, first order and higher order prediction. And then, of course, all of these behaviors depend on regulatory capacity. So this is an interesting paper. This is up on the OSF. If you go to our website, this is there, the Cybernetics Interest Group. So, as I said, in November, we had the Active Inference Symposium, the 5th Annual Active Inference Symposium. We had 2 talks there this year. The first was Neurosimulation of Spatial Intelligence. And this was a wide-ranging talk that kind of talked about spatial intelligence, not just as how we talk about spatial cognition in psychology, especially amongst mammals, when we talk about place cells and grid cells, but we also kind of expanded it out to talk about ecological psychology, talk about animal behavior, to talk about all these different ways in which different systems can do spatial integration, spatial cognition, and integrating motion with spatial spatial cues and having to do things like move in space. And so this integrated all of this it took in a bunch of different disciplines and thinking about this very broadly, and then we came away with some lessons for the future. And so it's really interesting kind of taking that very broad swipe at the topic, because it actually ended up with some really interesting outcomes. Along the way, we had some really interesting insights on complexity and how maybe you don't need very complex architectures for this. So there are a lot of things having to do with neural and cognitive architectures in this talk as well. So this was actually well received at the symposium. A lot of people were very interested in it. We haven't written up a paper for this yet, but it's probably coming in 2026. The other talk was on open source sustainability. This is sort of an update on this project that we've been doing for several years now. Of course, this is the project where we're looking at open source communities, and we're looking at how to characterize and build sustainable communities. That is, how do you build an open source project that can sustain itself over time? And so we've approached this from sort of almost like a simulation perspective or a possibilistic perspective. So we'd like to know not only like how to characterize open source communities that exist, but we'd like to know what it looks like to be sustainable. And sometimes that looks very different than what we assume is the case. And so we've thought about this very broadly, not just thinking about metrics from existing projects, but thinking about what are the underpinnings of sustainable open source projects. So that means we have to think about collective behavior, or open source as a collective behavior problem. We also have to think about this as a problem of reinforcement learning. And so to that end, we've used agent-based modeling and reinforcement learning and active inference to kind of hit at different aspects of this problem, but also implement them as simulations. And so if you go through that talk, we talk a lot about the agent-based models, the measures, the math behind the reinforcement learning, but also how that connects to active inference. And of course, if you're familiar with active inference, you know that that's going to be a key component of how agents can perceive sort of, working together and maybe finding the sweet spot between individual gain and cooperation. So this is all in this talk. These are both on our YouTube channel, and this involved our open source and open science interest group, as well as our representational brains and phenotype interest group. So these are the publications. The first one, the augmentation of intelligent agents for human machine super performance. This was myself and Morgan Huff, and this was in Studies in Computational Intelligence, which is forthcoming. We also had A Good Regulator May Provide a World Model for Intelligent Systems. This is, of course, accepted at Royal Society A, but it's also available on the archive. Just look up the title and you'll find the archive stub. This was myself, Morgan Huff, Amanda Nelson, and Jesse Parent. That's the core of our cybernetic interest group. They also had this paper, A Brief History of Cybernetic Imperatives and Behavior. This is on the OSF preprints of this DOI. And we have myself, Morgan Huff, Amanda Nelson, and Jesse Parent. Again, this involved the cybernetic interest group. And then this final paper, which is just myself, Phylogenetic Models of Embodied Agents, an Eco-Evo-Devo approach. So for the paper, it expanded out the phylogenetic models and framed it in this Eco-Evo-Devo approach, which is something in biology it's very popular right now, where you think about the ecological setting, you think about evolution, you think about development, and you think about all those things together. So this is coming out in this IOP conference series proceeding, and we don't have the number yet, but it's also forthcoming. So this year was also marked sort of a milestone for our involvement with BICA and our involvement with Embodied Intelligence Conference. And the reason I say that is because it forms this longer arc of our cognitive modeling and embodied cognition work. So we've been doing those two conferences for 4 years now. We have, we have 5 papers, I think, from each, 4 or 5 papers from each. And so, we've been able to lay out sort of an argument for our view on cognitive modeling and then our view on embodied cognition. And for embodied cognition, this is focused mainly on our developmental Bradenburg vehicles work. It's expanded that work. It's helped us lay out the case for developmental simulation, developmental neurosimulation, and what in the first talk that I gave at Embodied Cognition, something we call developmental AI. And it's actually interesting to watch that evolution of that perspective, because it's kind of started with this sort of stab at developmental AI, but then it developed into its own thing. And it's much more sophisticated now. I think our experience with the Embodied Intelligence Workshop is very useful in sort of making that more sophisticated. I think similarly with the BICA conference, we've been working out some cognitive modeling ideas. Those ideas are a little bit more eclectic, but I think they fit together well so that you can say that these are things that are interesting about cognition that other groups aren't really talking about. So this is our BICA conference experience from 2021 to 2025. So in 2021, we started out with this paper on Gibsonian information. And this was, of course, a paper where we characterized information as this form of direct perception into the nervous system. So that necessitates a cognitive model that you can build from characterizing the ecological inputs in terms of these distributions that they get processed in an internal model. So we kind of lay everything out in that paper, and then we had another paper. It was a preprint in 2024 where we talked about, laid out kind of more of the mathematics and more of the argument, expanded out what Gibsonian information means and how it's relevant to computational agents mainly. So we started out with Gibsonian information. Then we went to 2022, where we had this paper, Layers, Folds, and Semi-Neuronal Information Processing. This is taking this idea that we actually worked out at an agent-based modeling conference, where we talked about these metabrains. This is something Jesse and I have been working on. So we've been talking about this idea about metabrains, and metabrains are layered representations in sort of a model. So you have maybe 3 layers. Each layer has a different specificity of representation. So maybe one layer is non-representative. The other layer has sort of a higher level of abstraction, it has a higher level of representation. And then the third layer is a very explicit neural representation. As it gets deep in the weeds of cognitive science, thinking about representation, the degree of representation we think the brain is doing to things from the environment, from information from the environment. And the idea here is it's basically a neurosymbolic model. So you have one layer, which is kind of a neuro layer or a purely connectionist layer. You have another layer that's has a little bit more representational heft, and then maybe a third layer, which is something that's maybe purely semantic. And so the idea is you connect those three layers together, you coordinate their inputs and outputs, and you have this nice neurosymbolic model. And in 2022, we gave this talk on these models that are layered, but also that they represent geometry. They could represent a body, they could represent specific shapes or specific relations. And we used the example of the gut or the mini brain as an example of how you can apply these kind of layered systems to different types of information processing and agents. So you're like, why is this relevant? Well, we could build things like robots or intelligent agents with different types of information processing structures that maybe aren't reminiscent of the central nervous system. Maybe they process a lot of different types of sensory inputs, different types of self-monitoring inputs, things like that. And there's a geometry, of course, that they can conform to because they have these layers that can then be folded up in different ways, and they can serve to process information from all different angles in local environment. It could be the local environment, it could be the environment within the agent. So it was an interesting kind of approach to, like you might think of like a robotics application, or you might think of an augmentation application where you're building some sort of artificial prosthetic for a human or something like that. So that was 2022. 2023, then I did this paper on super performance, sampling, planning, and ecological information. There's this analogy I used in the paper where you have a human that's trying to swat a fly. And the thing about the fly is it samples its environment at a much higher rate than the humans sample their environment. So the fly can sense and detect motion much quicker than the human. And so this is why we have trouble swatting flies, because the fly can kind of move and respond faster because it has this higher sampling rate in its visual system. And so then we played around with that a little bit in the paper, simulated what it might look like if you had both attributes in the same agent and what the consequences of that were. So that was an interesting paper, but it also fed into what we did in 2025 with our human-machine super performance idea. So 2023 fed into 2025. 2024 is this allostasis machines as continuous cognitive modeling. And it took inspiration from the 2021 paper as well as a little bit from the 2023 paper. So we actually wrote an allostasis machines paper for another conference. I think it was a human-computer interaction conference, where we talked about these regulatory models that thought about allostasis as a set of stable states that were sort of derived from interactions with the environment. So you'd have this system that's in sort of a stable state. It gets perturbed by the environment, and it's a measure of how well the system can recover to new states, or how long it takes to recover to that new state given the size of the perturbation. So it's a very interesting dynamical systems model where you perturb the system in real-time behavior and it settles into different types of stable states, or it kind of migrates off to an unstable state. And so that is something that can be applied to cognitive modeling, especially continuous cognitive modeling, where you need to have this continuous response. It doesn't make sense to model allostasis and modeled the response to perturbations as a discrete phenomena, because that's not the way our brains work, and that's certainly not the way a lot of environmental perturbations work. So it was working at this idea of allostasis and allostasis machines in terms of cognitive modeling that's continuous and that links to naturalistic behavior and agents that are doing this sort of naturalistic sort of exploration of their environment. Then finally, in 2025, we had this paper, The Augmentation of Intelligent Agents for Human-Machine Superperformance. It does take some inspiration from the allostasis machines idea in that we're augmenting cognition in a continuous way, but it's also taking inspiration from the superperformance paper, where we're using this model of superperformance, of super sampling and super planning as this model for being able to augment our human machine system in different ways. So we're kind of building out this sort of perspective. We're building each year in different ways and improving our approach. And eventually we'd like to have this set of tools or the set of approaches that we could apply to building an agent. And so that brings us to the Embodied Intelligence Workshop, which was much more focused on this idea of developmental neurosimulation and working out the details of those. So again, we went through these different publications. So MetaBrain Models was presented in this agent-based workshop that we did, I think in 2021. But in 2022, we actually published in the conference proceedings the paper on biologically inspired cognitive agents. So we did do the MetaBrain Models work as part of this Embodied Intelligence Workshop series. And so in 2021, of course, we did this very general approaches to developmental embodied neurosimulation, which laid out some of the things we've done in the past and what needs to be done in the future. In 2022, of course, we worked out the MetaBrains models into a paper. In 2023, we worked out this notion of intelligence offloading in the context of neurosimulation of developmental agents. Basically, intelligence offloading is where you use the environment to offload intelligence or to gain intelligence from the environment instead of into formal architecture. And so that involves embodiment, but that also involves a sort of extended cognition where you're extending your cognition beyond your body. And so this is, again, building up to, what do we need to build embodied agents? What is our perspective on embodiment? And developmental perspective on embodiment, to be sure. In 2024, we did this paper on continual developmental neurosimulation using embodied computational agents. This was on the sort of idea of continual learning and continual cognition. And then, of course, using a developmental approach to look at how we can approach continual learning. And so we have this diagram in the paper where it kind of considers development and neurosimulation and continual learning at many different scales, from very short time scales in the brain to these very long multi-generational time scales that involve cultural learning and cultural transmission. So that sets us up for 2025, which is this phylogenetic models of embodied agents paper. This lays out this sort of eco-evo-devo approach. So we have this developmental encoding that produces these developmental agents. We can then look at their evolutionary trajectory through a phylogenetic tree analysis. We can then look at how development is affected by evolution. And then we can look at the ecological constraints on the body and on the evolution of these systems. But we can also look at things like cultural evolution and how cultural evolution and biological, or in this case, phylogenetic evolution, diverge. And so those are all things we talked about in that paper. And I'd like to look at the 2024 paper and the 2025 paper, sort of these, look at them together and see what we can get out of that. So that's what we've been doing at the Embodied Intelligence Workshop. I think we're getting an emerging set of themes out of this work, and I hope in the next year to kind of bring those together into some really interesting scholarship. So as usual, we are focused on blogging, topical development, and outreach. So in February, I did a post for Darwin Day, which was this post on carcinization. This is a phenomena in marine invertebrates where they have this sort of convergence of phenotype. So you get these different types of crabs. There's a lot of diversification, but eventually there's this pressure to evolve sort of a similar phenotype. And I know this is a popular science thing, so I tried to approach this from, by looking at the literature, kind of defining what is exactly is meant by carcinization, what are the evolutionary mechanisms here, especially so there are some papers on how this applies exclusively to decapod evolution, and really kind of thinking about this as an example of convergent evolution, and then thinking about the underlying molecular phenotypes and what we can learn from that. And so, we're thinking about this essentially from a developmental perspective, from a phylogenetic perspective. And then later in the article, I talk about the computational modeling, of which there is some really interesting computational modeling of this phenomena. So this is definitely a post to check out. This was done for Darwin Day. I talked about this post a little bit in the DevoWorm meeting, the DevoWorm meeting number 10 for 2025. So if you go to the DevoWorm YouTube channel, you'll find that meeting, and then you'll find this talk within it. So this is the link to the Synthetic Daisies blog post. We also updated our OREL medium this year. So this is, of course, something we've been running for several years, and we had a really sizable number of posts this year. In January to start off, I did a deep dive into DevoWorm, which was kind of going over our meetings and thinking about what we were doing and where we're going. Then Jesse gave a number of posts. He talked about how best to apply to Google Summer of Code. So he gave some good tips on what you need to do to be a good applicant. And that's, of course, always useful for our applicants. He also gave a short post that was a cross post from his Substack, I believe. And it just talks a little bit about how to manage projects, how to think about iteration in project management, how to make different types of changes to your project, how to take feedback into account, and how the iteration or the iterative approach beats stagnation, which is, of course, where you just sit on ideas and you try to perfect them without any feedback. And so this is just a talk on some of his ideas here. Then I gave a little welcome to our Google Summer of Code Scholars for 2025. This is another thing that we did. I was involved in doing these AI summaries this year, so I wanted to post on what my philosophy was on using AI summaries of our meetings. So we did a number of different summaries on our meetings, because we have a vast number of meetings on our YouTube channel, actually on the OREL YouTube channel as well as the DevoWorm YouTube channel. And so I have these 6-month interval summaries that exist on the YouTube channel. And it kind of takes the really big themes from that 6-month period and kind of brings it to life. And so I think that's kind of always what we've been trying to do in terms of making sense of academic ephemera. So, Jesse has this idea of the twirly-bird method, which is where you capture these ephemera during meetings, the things that people just mention and then just get forgotten about. Trying to bring those out and make those salient. Then Vidi Rohira, who is one of our Google Summer of Code scholars, she published a number of different posts on the Medium. She did her midterm evaluation. She did this project on something called Sustain Hub, which was an approach to the open source sustainability project that involved reinforcement learning. And so she describes that in terms of what she did at the middle of the project period and then at the end of the project period. So I recommend that if you're interested in what happened this year in the lab, to go through our OREL Medium, and I think that gives a good representative sample of some of the, at least from this perspective of Google Summer of Code and maybe some of our project management activities, and some of the other things we're thinking about. I think that's a good place to go for that. We also attended a number of events. So usually, one of us attends an event where we can, and then another person attends an event, and that gives us a pretty big footprint, and a pretty diverse footprint at that. So we attended a lot of events this year. So there's Jesse at the upper left, and he attended the Human Augmentation Summit at MIT. And we actually did a live stream from the event. So he walked us around the event, and we saw all the different things that were going on there. So congratulations to Jesse. That was a very useful event for him to attend, because it brought together a lot of his interests, especially in interacting with that group at MIT. I attended the Averse Symposium at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. And this was an event that celebrated XR, virtual reality, and augmented reality, and a lot of talks on industry, a lot of talks on academic work, a lot of talks on applications. So that was a very useful event to attend, thinking about the state of the art in that area. Then, of course, we attended the Active Inference Symposium. That was on YouTube, so everyone was involved in that. We gave 2 talks there, as I mentioned, and I was involved in it as a co-organizer of the event. So this is an event where Daniel Friedman, who's the head of the Active Inference Institute, he spends like 48 hours doing these live streams and kind of just going through one talk after another. And I don't envy him for that, but in any case, that was a very good event. It was very useful for us. And it was very interesting seeing what was going on in that space. Then the Frontier Tower, which is Morgan Huff's territory, they had a number of events this year. One of them was a Longevity Summit in June. And this is where, they get people from the venture capital space and the startup space in San Francisco, and they bring them together and they try to get these initiatives off the ground there. So some very exciting stuff going on there. Morgan has his finger on the pulse of a lot of these types of activities, both in San Francisco and also in Europe. So, and then we had the GSOC Mentor Summit, which was held this year in Munich, and this was Sarah Bastawala. Sarah Bastawala was Google Summer of Code Scholar in 2024, and she was now mentor, and so she attended the summit in Munich. And she actually gave a talk on the open source sustainability project. It was different from the talk we gave to Active Inference Institute, but it was very well received there. So congratulations to all of our event attendees, and hopefully people are aware of what we're doing. This is an example of Sarah's experience at Google Summer of Code Mentor Summit. So this is her name tag. She was the first-time mentor. She was, was involved in all these events. She gave a sort of an ad hoc talk that, they wanted to know some things about the metrics, the human variables, and other things that were involved in this project. And then this is where they were doing this project. This is one of the head people at Google who organized Google Summer of Code through Google. So definitely a good time, a good exposure for Sarah. Congratulations. This was Jesse at the MIT Augmented Cognition event. So this was an interesting experiment we did. We did this on a Saturday morning. He had his camera at the event, and we walked around the event and took a look at all the things going on. And this is the Boston skyline here. from Cambridge. So we had, I think we did a pretty good job. It was like an hour-long tour, and we learned a lot about the event. So congratulations to Jesse on that. So I wanted to talk a little bit about education and mentorship activities this year, because part of our lab's mission is education and teaching and mentorship. So of course we had our Google Summer of Code project. This was we had 3 scholars this year, 2 of them located in DevoWorm, and 1 of them located in open source, one of them located in open source, in the open source sustainability project. And so this is Leilith Baru, who did some work on using neural developmental programs for building those for C. elegans using growing hypergraph neural networks, or HNNs. So he was interested in hypergraph neural networks. That continues our work on hypergraph neural networks that we've been doing since like 2020. And then we did some work on neural developmental programs last year, and that continues that work as well. So he was working on both of those things simultaneously. And I have in the DevoWorm annual update, I have more information about these 2 projects. So you can go there to learn more. Leilith, of course, was one of our scholars. Jayadratha Gayan was another one of our scholars, and he did a different approach for his project. He worked on something called DevoWorm TG, and that was developmental temporal graph networks. So again, we're interested in graph networks, but in a different way, looking at their evolution and growth over time. And so this was, this resulted, I think, in some really interesting work. Jayadratha and myself were working on a paper we hope to get out into the world soon. And Leilith has been working with DevoWorm on a number of things, and hopefully we can also get some work out on what he did in the last year soon as well. And then, of course, Vidi picked up sort of where Sarah left off in 2024. She built this project called Sustain Hub, which is where she did a lot of reinforcement learning and linked it to agent-based modeling. And she did a lot of interesting work with refining a lot of the metrics that you can use to characterize contributions and other types of activities in an open source project. Now, I worked on this through the University of Illinois. This is an independent study I run called Illinois Model Builder. So I did this last fall, and I did this fall, sort of as a refinement of what I did last year. Basically, what I do is I get a bunch of students, and we kind of have a curriculum that we follow. I tell them, if you have a project you want to work on, you can work on a project. Otherwise, we'll find a project for you. But the idea is to allow the students to work on a project involving building some sort of computational model. And the idea isn't to perfect the model. The idea is to go through the motions and figure out how to build a model, to think critical about modeling, to think critically about the different decisions you have to make about getting data, about what kinds of tests to run, about what kinds of model assumptions are warranted for what you're doing, and to bring that all together into a final product. And so they don't need to have a really refined final product. They just need to go through the motions to show to show that they're thinking about these things, and that they get some experience in getting their hands dirty in model building. And then each week I give a lecture, which is about 30 minutes long, on some topic in model building. So it could be about thinking about models, how to think like a modeler, thinking about spurious patterns and correlations, thinking about what kinds of representations you use in your model, thinking about modeling as a hard problem, not an easy problem, thinking about image processing, agent-based modeling, kind of thinking about how you can implement large language models and when to implement large language models, thinking about Bayesian modeling and its appropriateness, algorithmic thinking and applications to modeling. So we also want to move into this space of having people learn about what algorithms are and how to deploy them, flock swarms and collective behavior, which of course are different types of models that might be if used for some problems but not others. IID data, which is independently and identically distributed data. And then, of course, differentiating that from temporal data and spatial data. So, a lot of times students will work with data and they'll assume it's IID data, but it might actually be a time series or spatially dependent data. And so I wanted them to understand that difference. And of course, with that assumption comes different types of statistical tests and different types of modeling decisions that you have to make. And then finally, talking about invariance and universal features. Basically, when you model your data, a lot of times your data will have some sort of set of universal features. Sometimes you can use models that are universal models that apply maybe to also, it could apply to a social system, it could apply to a biological system. Sometimes some models don't apply to universally. And so just to understand what those differences are and how to deal with them when you're confronted with them. So this has been pretty successful. I've had a lot of good feedback on this. And so hopefully, I can, first of all, maybe continue on my model builder. But secondly, maybe have different versions for different universities, or maybe have just an OREL specific version that's run online. I think this basic formula should be useful to a wide range of people, and I hope to make progress on this in the next year. Now, we have our YouTube channel, of course, and we don't really spend a lot of time, we're not influencers, but we do spend a lot of, we do, kind of it serves as our core of our lab. So, we have people distributed all over the world, and we have people who might be interested in the lab but don't attend our meetings. We might have people who are interested in joining our group but don't know what we're about. And so our YouTube channel serves to fill all of those needs. Now, we're not interested necessarily in being influencers or monetizing the channel, but we do want to have some, signs that people are paying attention. And it looks like we did have that this year. So these are our statistics from 2025. Our videos got 3,619 views, which is, it's not the kind of numbers you get for big time monetized channels, but it's not bad, especially given that it's pretty dry academic content most of the time. And so we have, we had more views in 2024, but that's, I don't know why that is. We had fewer watch time hours, and we had 79 subscribers, but we had more in 2024. I'm not really sure why that is. It's not clear, because we did diversify our the way we present our videos this year, and it could be that we're not getting anyways. So I don't really know why that is. In any case, I think we did all right this year. We have 310 subscribers as of today, December 27th. We have a number of videos that were kind of really top content for the year, and so that's here. So our number one video was an overview of NeurIPS for 2025, the NeurIPS conference. We did this pre-conference overview as part of our Saturday morning meeting that had 514 views. So that's been like a month since that was made to go live, and we've had 514 views, so it's pretty good. The Steve McGrew actually died last year, but we have this lecture that he gave in 2017 on something called fight geography, and that's a technique that is used in imaging, and so I think it's probably a one-of-a-kind resource on that. In any case, it got quite a few views. We also had the more content for NeurIPS. We had our Saturday morning NeuroSim meeting for February 15th. I can't quite remember what we did that week, but that was another top performing video. Amanda Nelson's talk on embodied neurophenomenology from 2023. That got a lot of views. Jesse's recap of the Augmentation Lab event at MIT, that got a lot of views. And then we had some Saturday morning meetings One of our AI summaries, our summary of cybernetics, got a lot of views, and so on and so forth. So you can see that we maybe could get some more viewership, but I think we've got a decent formula for this. So again, if you're interested in our meeting schedule, we have our Saturday morning NeuroSim meetings. We'll continue those in the next year. Those will be Saturday mornings at 10 a.m. Eastern Time. We also have our DevaWare meetings, which will continue to be held on Mondays at 10 a.m. Eastern. And then our open source meeting, which is seasonal. What I'll do is I'll have the open source meeting in the late spring to early fall. And then I'll have the Illinois Model Builder usually in the fall at that time. I might also change it up a little bit because we won't have Illinois Model Builder this spring with something else. So we might extend open source, we might do something else. But that Friday at noon Eastern time block is when that will happen. So we have 3 meetings now. We might have a 4th or a 5th meeting coming up, and Jesse's interested in hosting some meetings, either seasonal or kind of longer term meetings. And so stay tuned for those times. Now, I wanted to mention that we did have these notebook LM summaries, so these AI summaries of our meetings. We have some for our Saturday morning NeuroSim meetings. We have, you have to go to the YouTube channel to check, but I think we have from 2023 to 2025 inclusive, so 2 per year. And then, of course, I did a cybernetics recap of our cybernetics interest group meetings. So we've had our cybernetics interest group meeting. We had regular weekly meetings from like late 2023 to early 2025, and so those were summarized, and those contain some really interesting pieces of information there about some of the things that came out of that interest group. And of course, we also had the papers come out of the interest group. Congratulations, everyone who was involved in that. So again, this is our current meeting schedule, and those meetings will be live on YouTube, and see you in 2026.